Today we are going to talk about how we talk about um, underrepresented people, particularly African American citizens, but in general, kind of underrepresented people. All of us are working really hard to document and protect our state's architectural record. But most of us, I'm going to guess, I can't see everyone on the call, but I'm going to guess that almost everyone on this call is white. And we bring our own unrecognized biases to the table when we study history. And that means that sometimes we, and I mean we, like me too, we overlook or we forget or we exclude people, histories, buildings, sometimes whole neighborhoods, and we need to do a better job with that. Today, Dr. Johnson is going to address our writing and help us be more thoughtful, more humane, more inclusive, and more sensitive in our writing. Dr. Valerie Ann Johnson is the Dean of Arts, Sciences, and Humanities and a professor of sociology. And she's currently the interim co-director of the Center for Racial and Social Justice, all at Shaw University right here in downtown Raleigh. She serves on the North Carolina Historical Commission, the National Register Advisory Committee, and she's the chair of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. She also serves as board chair for Preservation North Carolina. Dr. Johnson, along with Dr. Lynn Harris, who is in the Maritime Studies program at ECU, co-edited Excavating the Histories of Slave Trade and Pirate Ships, Property, Plunder, and Loss. That was published by Springer Press in 2022. Dr. Johnson has been a real pleasure to work with on NRAC, and we are delighted that she was ready and willing to join us during the consultants workshop, and especially happy that she was willing to do this webinar at this point. So, Dr. Johnson, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. And I am excited to finally be in front of you all, even if it's in a virtual space. And I'd like to take this time again to offer my thanks to you as consultants for being willing to show up. And I see a few of the consultants that I know, that I've worked with, and we're going to have a conversation, I hope, of sorts. I know this is virtual space, but I've got a slide presentation and it should elicit some kind of conversation between us as we talk about writing our history and act with consequences. So right now I am going to pull up the PowerPoint and get us started. So I'm starting with the building to my right, or to the right, that says was the Baptist headquarters. And as you look down the street, you can see Red Hat, this tall building, and barely behind the parking lot, there is a structure that I'll talk about a little bit later. This Baptist building may or may not be with us for very long. There are ideas about redoing the space, and it is also the prerogative of those who have property to do with it as they will. But we lose things in that, and that's why I so appreciate your consultants' work on helping us at least document and preserve what we can. For this morning's workshop, I'm inspired by the lecture Toni Morrison gave when she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993. She spoke about language and how we must understand its power and agency. She said in part, quote, "Being a writer," she, Toni Morrison, thinks of language partly as a system, partly as a living thing over which one has control, but mostly as agency, as an act with consequences. And that's what I'd like for y'all to remember as we go through this presentation, that your writing, our writing together, about these various resources and properties are acts with consequence. I also thought that we can think of the African concept of nomo, which is a Dogon word. Dogon are in what is now called Mali. And it's a word that implies the power of words to create balance and harmony. It doesn't mean that we all agree upon the same thing, but there is a certain fairness that's inherent in that idea of balance and harmony. And finally, I want to acknowledge that y'all, the consultants, those of you who do these surveys and nominations, have tremendous power. And so I want you to use that power for good to help us understand these properties in the best way possible. So right now, I think, I'm not sure if you can, oops. Okay. When you look at this particular home, put in the chat, tell me how you would describe this. What kind of resource is this? Are there any features of interest? And you can just put things in the chat or raise your hand. I don't know if y'all are muted, but we do have the chat feature for you to put in any ideas. What comes to mind what adjectives would you use to describe this particular structure? I see residential and adaptive. Ranch house. Brick ranch house, thank you. Or brick ranch home. Stylish ranch house with distinctive broad brick chimney, splicing facade. Yes, unusual slab chimney. Remember that a little bit later. Give you one more minute to give us some more adjectives. Yes, something going on with the chimney. Decorative stone. Okay, thank you all. Sometimes this home has been referred to as modest. And that is a word that does come up. And when it does, it is in general considered to be not the most positive word. So I like the words like stylish, that is positive without being over the top, or it's really a very descriptive word. Okay. Okay, there it goes. Sorry. So I looked up the word modest because I have found that in some of the language that's been used to describe homes in the African American context. And prudent, quiet, simple, unassuming, and you see the list of words that come from the thesaurus: retiring, resigned, reserved. These are not necessarily the words that the Black community would use to describe the home that you just saw, partly because they understand the context. And those of us, those living in the neighborhood where this home is, or from the town where this home is, would know it as belonging to a very storied history, the G.C. Hawley Middle School in Creedmoor. So it's not necessarily a modest home. Stylish, yes. Interesting chimney, which is reflective of African American aesthetic, but it's also most associated with the Reverend G.C. and Frances Hawley, and the way in which G.C. Hawley contributed to Granville County with through education, through social services, through a variety of things in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, he brought to this county. And it's also an example of how Blacks built their own educational system. So to the far left, where you see the arrow, is G.C. Hawley, Reverend G.C. Hawley. This is the first class, 1938, of the middle school that he built or had built using the community. The middle school doesn't exist completely in its earliest version. They used leftover wood, planks, timber. They cleared a land that was given to them by an African-American homeowner. All of this to say that there's this rich context when associated with the G.C. Hawley and Frances Hawley home. And this is Reverend Hawley in his office in the latter years of his life. So when you look at that residence, you might see that brick ranch. But as you write about who it is associated with, you get this broader history that is connected to not just here in North Carolina, but it's also connected to Lincoln University, where Reverend Hawley attended. It's connected to Langston Hughes, who came several times and stayed with Reverend Hawley and his wife, and actually played piano with their daughter. So this is a part of that context that we hope, as you are investigating properties, that you're going to write about. This was going to be y'all's homework, where you were to look at this particular article. And it's about a spring festival that was being held in one of the counties. It's called Festival Day, and they had a thing called Old Slave Day. So my question to you to think about is, when you find articles that have this kind, that talk about the history, how do you frame it in a way that is true to what was written at the time, but also reflective of where we are now? That's a fine line to walk, but it's something to really consider, because as people read through those nomination forms and use them for resources themselves, what is it that they're going to find? How are they going to understand these people in this old slave idea? And you look at the dignity of these men. What is their story? How do we understand them? If we read it from this particular newspaper article, they are thought of as just enslaved slave persons. And in the text, I know it's kind of blurry, but it says that this festival featured Old Slave Day, and it was a day set aside for those of the colored race who lived during slavery days. And they talk about how these old timers came from far and near, spent a day in the municipal park, telling of their experiences and recollections to the thousands that gathered about to see and hear them. Then there was some kind of entertainment that was offered, and white and colored participated. And if they were hoping that this would be something that would be repeated. I'm conflicted about having the Old Slave Day. While I would have been interested in hearing the stories that the men had to tell, it is more in terms of entertainment, and I'm not sure how people would have taken without having more commentary from like the Black press, or from interviewing family members who heard the stories, whether this would be just kind of a reminiscing, thinking about in a kind of fond recollection of what slavery meant, or was this really an opportunity to learn history? And how does that play into how we understand the various resources associated with this? So you see the term Black, brown, the term colored was used here. What do we do with this terminology? How do we best represent people with all of these different adjectives associated with them? So before I kind of answer that, which I will get to in a minute, I wanted to, and this is kind of, for me, it's a little bit difficult, run through a few slides of the images that were very much prevalent during the time that of the old slavery days that you saw that. So here is one advertisement for salted peanuts. Or this one, postcard, greetings. And think about that imagery and the terms that are used to depict African American Black communities. Here are virgin fishing lucky lures. And then this one is pretty ubiquitous. It is called the Hottentot Venus. First of all, Hottentot is a pejorative word for the Khoi peoples of Southern Africa, South Africa in particular. And this is from the work of how Sarah Bartman, and that is her Dutch name, who was Khoi, was paraded in Europe in the 1800s, and she was known as this Venus because of the fascination folk had with her buttocks. She was displayed nude, and her remains were put in a jar in the Louvre des Musées, the Museum of Man in France, until 1994, when she was finally repatriated back to Africa. But this imagery, this idea, the sexuality of the Black woman pervades our discussions and the ways in which we might unconsciously have these biases that Sarah talked about earlier. Again, Uncle Remus, they don't even show this movie anymore. On the right is Uncle Remus being depicted in The Song of the South by Walt Disney. And that's a whole nother topic to go into. On the left is the publication by Joel Chandler Harris, recollecting the songs and sayings of Uncle Remus and folklore from the old plantation. So it's cast as, here's these witty folk sayings and from the old plantation. This was in Georgia. But it is a hard depiction because it is such a stereotype. And so we want to think about how stereotypes may play into what we notice of a community, of a resource, of a people. And all of these photographs come from the Jim Crow Museum, which is an online museum, and it has much more memorabilia. And it's not to titillate folks, but to document what existed during the time of Jim Crow that continued to promote white supremacy. And that is something that frames many of the ways in which we understand the various resources that are associated with African Americans. I'm going to stop here for a minute to see if there are any questions. And again, as you have questions, just put them in the chat, and Elizabeth King will let me know when to stop and to answer those questions. So as you think of them, just put them in the chat. I found this I said, keep an ever vigilant eye out, because this was a dish towel that I found in one of the stores around the town I live in, Oxford. And again, it's that stereotyped notion of the Black woman as an island woman with the chickens on top of her head, and the young man barefoot and without a shirt. And so, this would have been a popular kind of artifact at one time in our history. And then this goes back to the idea of a Black woman on display. Um, this is a, depicts the moment when actually gynecology in a way was born, and there was experimentation on Black women's bodies. And so I put this in because it reminds us a little bit of that idea of experimentation and a distancing of Black women's bodies from themselves and the gaze of these white males. What does that have to do with the resources that you document? Well, it informs a perspective, and I'm calling to your attention to be aware of that perspective and to think about how you write about it in a way that's fair, accurate, but also is not demeaning. So I put this in. So I like, again, for you to put in adjectives to just that come to mind when you see this particular face. Do you know what she's thinking? Or do you have any idea of what it is that's going on with her particular look? Skeptical, questioning, anger, or disgust. Suspicion. Need much more context. Annoyance. Actually, she was just listening. She was listening to some testimony. But that is a face in repose. But we don't normally think of that particular aspect of a Black woman. Oftentimes that look is interpreted as angry or menacing or aggressive.
All right, I've got doctor's appointments next Monday and Tuesday. So if we go to
Kitty,
Pennsylvania,
make sure you're muted if you're not
Yeah.
Dr. Thompson.
Hello, okay, I'm back. And it wasn't, I captured this particular picture as the woman talked about herself in this pose as being thought of as aggressive. So I call that to your attention also in the ways in which we interact with people that we're eliciting the stories or the context for understanding resources. Okay, this is my nod to science fiction. Octavia Butler is, and you say, okay, she's gone off the rails here, but not really. Octavia Butler also, this was one of her first novel, Dawn. When she published this novel, and Octavia Butler was known for her science fiction work as a Black woman, one of the first to win a Hugo Nebula Award. This is the power of the image. When I first saw this book in a bookstore, it was in a Black bookstore, and I was, the owner was asking me about whether or not I wanted, what did I like? And I said science fiction, but that I had difficulty finding any written by Black women. That was what I was interested in. She said, well, do you know Octavia Butler? I said, no. And she put this book in my hand, and I looked at it and said, well, what is this? Turns out that because Octavia wasn't known at the time, the publishers decided to put two white women on the cover, kind of appealing to who they thought was the audience. And this is thinking about the variety of people who would look at your nominations or read, not just the National Park Service, but all the persons who will be reading these nominations. And in this case, the idea from the publisher was that only teenage white boys were really reading science fiction. So they put these white women. Neither one of these women are described or appear in the book. The book's protagonist is a Black woman, and she encounters aliens that look nothing like this. In fact, this scene is very deceptive because it's not really in the book. This is a way of shifting, of framing a context before even getting into the depth of the writing by just using this erroneous cover. And if I hadn't had someone point it out to me, I would have ignored the book altogether because it didn't seem to be what I was looking for. So it's interesting what we depict, how we depict it, and how we use these terms. I talked about it earlier, Black or brown or indigenous or Native American. All these different terms for all the peoples that we encounter. I would say, and I follow Dr. Paul Ortiz in this, you need to go by how what people call themselves. And it may be in the nomination, you're going to have conflicting ideas about how to name something. And I see that Heather Shane is participating. She knows very well from the work in Greensboro, in an African-American neighborhood in Greensboro, where the nomination form were deciding what to name it, what to name the neighborhood, because there are several names, one given by the city of Greensboro that doesn't reflect what the people themselves called their neighborhood. So I draw your attention to that in order to think about what are the people, how are the people talking about their own resource? What are they saying about it? How are they framing it? What words are being used? So in that way, here is a self-identification. It's a piece of art, and it is about a family incorporating various aspects of the family, from old pictures to young pictures to who the people are. And you can see prominent here is a woman named Elaine, and she's featured because this is her story, her family story, and you can pick from that things that are important. The idea here is self-identification. How is it that we understand ourselves and put that forward? So preservation is about maintaining our connection to our stories, all of our stories. This particular home is in Newbern, and it's in a Black community. And it is the John Thomas Barber House. Mr. Thomas was a professor. He was someone that the community, this Black community, recognized as an important educator. And they erected their own marker for him. So there are various ways of which markers are installed across the state. We've got our own state highway marker program. You'll see another reference I'll make in a few minutes of our, the African American Heritage Commission has a civil rights marker system. So there are different ways that people can say this is an important site. For this particular community, and you see it's very wordy, it has a lot to say. It's telling us the importance of the person whose house this is, why this house is important. It's also a beautiful, at least on the outside, a beautiful home. The context for the home is across the street from West Street School, which was a prominent school in New Bern for African Americans, elementary school. Talks about his teaching, his leadership in education. And I would be remiss in not saying that he graduated from Shaw University. He had various appointments, and he was the principal of the first brick graded school for African American residents in North Carolina. And that was the West Street School that's on the other side. I show this because, and this may be some ways in which you all find information, how you reference or how you would talk about a site. The neighborhood, you can roll right through it and maybe not even notice what's surrounding it, but it still has the vestiges of being this intact Black community. Getting to really learn about this community takes being with a resident, being with someone who's from New Bern, and being with someone who's knowledgeable. In my case, it was someone who works for the state, works at Triumph Palace, and who's able, as a lifelong resident of New Bern, to tell me the context of this particular building, of Mr. Barber, and of the importance of that whole community, even though it's now fragmented. I gave you this picture earlier, and where my arrow is pointing, and it's kind of overshadowed, but this is the side of the Pope House, and it is a city museum now. It has limited opening hours. It is an amazing story of, I would say, of resilience, of action, and of activity. And it's amazing because Dr. Pope crosses several different kinds of occupations in his lifetime. He ran for office in Raleigh at the time, but one of the things that associates him with this house with this particular street, is that it's one of the last remaining structures of Stronach Alley, which was a prominent African-American middle-class community in Raleigh, which is about 2 blocks away from Shaw University. Dr. Pope attended Leonard Medical School and graduated from Leonard Medical School when there was a medical school at Shaw University. So you can see, though, the pressures of, which I think also helps us in understanding the preservation of various sites, the pressure of this downtown development that basically has decimated a community, what was a community, and it took time to do so, but also how it just strikes me how this Red Hat, well, there's Red Hat, there's another building there too, just kind of almost overpowers this structure. As if you look south towards Shaw University, you see a very different reflection. At the same time, Shaw University is in the process of trying to reimagine itself, including erecting 10, 20-story buildings. That immediately gives us a change. What does that mean for this community? How do we write, for example, a nomination for a home that's situated such as this, as the Pope House? When you go into the structure, the fine details of the home give you an indication of the importance that this family had for the community, the ability to decorate, to create a certain kind of aesthetic within the home is something that is considered an important aspect of middle and upper middle class Black communities. So recognizing these features within the home is very important. As we were sitting there in the Pope House, one of the persons who was with me noticed on the furniture these symbols. And I just I know that in your practice as consultants, this is an important thing when you are providing documentation about a particular home, is noticing those fine details. Also, in looking at these details, it is reminiscent and reminds me of an African aesthetic, and that this was deliberate. There's also the feet of the furniture of this particular sofa, or animal feet, and it's subtle, but it gives us that connection back to um, knowing themselves as Black persons, which I think is important. Our imperfect past is something that I think about in the ways in which we recognize or talk about various resources. So one is the legacy of ownership. How will that impact the nomination for? How will you write about the various owners or occupants of a property? So I'll give you an example from the historic Magnolia House in Greensboro, and then even the Library of Congress can get something wrong sometimes. So some of you may be familiar with the Magnolia House. It's a Green Book site. It's one of the 4 remaining, active sites that we've identified so far. And when I say we, it's the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission have identified in North Carolina. It's taken a long time, but it has been restored. It serves as a bed and breakfast. They also provide shoebox lunches. They do a catering business. It sits several blocks from Bennett College on Gorel, depending on where you're from, Gorel Street in Greensboro. One of the things that the owner of the house now, Natalie Miller, has brought to my attention was in the original nomination, the house is called by the name of its white renter. And so as we go forward in time, and this is the idea around legacy of ownership, as we look at the different owners, that it is most notable as a Green Book owned by a particular family. So how to highlight that in such a way that overrides maybe earlier depictions of a property or a resource that was really created in a time where Black history was ignored or wasn't reckoned as being that important. But we know its importance as a Green Book site. And here's another Green Book property that's in New Bern. Again, it sort of sits there in the street, and as you look around, you see these empty spaces. Well, part of the story is of a great fire that occurred that wiped out a community. But here's this remaining Green Book site intact. And then I wanted to talk about this. This is from the Library of Congress, and it says that this is Shaw University, Raleigh, North Carolina Hospital. It is and it isn't. This is Leonard Hall Medical School that served for a short time as a hospital, but the hospital they're talking about that was constructed in 1910 is Tyler Hall. This is not Tyler Hall. This is Leonard Medical School, now Leonard Hall. It's true that it was funded in part by the American Baptist Home Mission Society. But this is wrong. This is not the hospital. This is the hospital. Very different building, right next door. This was constructed in 1910. The architect was Gaston Edwards. So the importance of this is that the first building was, the school opened in 1882. This was built in 1910, but its architect was Gaston Edwards, who was the first African-American or Black licensed architect in the state of North Carolina. He didn't do the previous building. So the care in eliciting the history of a Black community is so critical, so important. That's the power of the words, so that we don't have that previous photo erroneously. Even though I love that building, I love it as Leonard Medical School, which has its own storied history. And that Tyler Hospital was a hospital that, again, was built during Jim Crow, during a time where our facilities were separated, and that the physicians who had finished from Leonard Medical School would be practicing here. And that's a whole nother kind of story that needs to be told, but not when you call the building the wrong thing and it's in the Library of Congress, which has a certain heft and weight. Yes, and I draw your attention to a comment in the chat. Thank you for that comment, Cynthia de Miranda. These two buildings do tell us the continuing story of medical education, expansion of medical education. And you're right, conflating them diminishes the history. So the other question I would have you consider is, how does the community articulate the value, understanding, and knowledge of the resource? What do they say about it? Some of you from the Raleigh area may know Joe Holt Jr. And it's not enough time to go into the whole history of Mr. Holt, but to understand that he's in a church, Wilson Chapel in Oberlin Village, which was an historically Black community that is barely visible because of all of the development and gentrification that has happened in the community. But he's telling the story about how he, as a child, as a youngster, as a teenager, and his parents set out to desegregate the Raleigh school system. He was the child who they were trying to send to open up Brockton High School in Raleigh. His story is important because it gets overshadowed by the story of the Campbell family, where there was successful desegregation. But you have to have a starting point. You have to have a place where things start to heat up. And that was the story of the Holt family, who also is from Oberlin Village. He grew up in this area. So here is the marker I talked about earlier from the North Carolina Civil Rights Trail that documents the Holt family and how they were leading the effort to integrate the city of Raleigh. What Joe Holt Jr. tells us in talking about his experiences is what it felt like to be a teenager and to be the one that had to integrate. He was the one who would have had to go to the school. He ended up not going, but what happened along the way was he was sent to Eastern North Carolina when things got hot so that he wouldn't be in peril. So it was not an easy thing to do this. Capturing that story, not just by looking at this marker, but interviewing and talking to the Holt members of the Holt family, especially talking to Joe, tells you about the context of a community that is that is hard to visualize, hard to see because of this. and you look back, this is the family, here we're at the marker. But if you look at these structures, this is all up and down Oberlin, which just got rid of a whole another housing development just a little further north of here. So when you can't see that, how do you get that context? How do you understand what happened and the importance of whatever remaining resources there that you're trying to nominate for the register? You get it through the stories, through people recollecting, but you got to know who to find. And sometimes the signpost for that is a highway marker. This is going back to Shaw University. I can't help it. But here's Este Hall that was built in 1873. But more than the beauty of its structure is also its history, its story. How did it come to be built? Why is it called Este Hall? And how was it used originally? And in its original use, it's the first dormitory for Black women in the country. Because remember, Shaw is founded in 1865. Here, Black women are coming to school, and this is a dorm that was created for them. And there's some noted women like Dr. Louise Cecilia Lulu Fleming, who's in the first class of African Americans who graduated from women's medical school in Philadelphia. She has a short career because she dies fairly young, but her career includes working with the American Baptist Society, the Women's Society, to go into the Congo. And in her work in the Congo, not only providing medical care, but also encouraging young people to seek higher education, she sends students to Shaw University. And she stayed in Este Hall. And in some of her writings, she talks about staying in that dorm. So it's more than just the beautiful Italianate building that we see, but it's also this place of the stories of Black women seeking higher education in the United States in the late 1800s. I'm going to pause here for a minute to see if there are any questions or comments or observations that anyone would have. And if so, I encourage you to put them in the chat. And as I go forward some more, a little bit about Holtz Chapel. Now, I was talking about primarily urban areas, but there are also, as you all know, the resources that are in our rural areas, including the Rosenwald schools and the one-room schools. So this was a restoration project that was done in Orenthal. It's spelled Oriental, but I was told it's pronounced Orenthal, North Carolina, way down on the coast. And this is the chapel that they have now turned into a community center, but was a school. And I just put this in here for y'all consultants, just looking at what was left, and you can see the remnants of an old basketball court, so you can write about what was there, and partly how the restoration has been conducted. So this is the great hall in Holtz Chapel in the community center. So attending various functions or activities that are conducted there is also another way to get that community input, to understand that history, so that the context can be written as fully as possible. Why was this important for this community? Why was this particular building important for this community, and how it moves forward in time? I turn back to other ways that we find information is through the writings and being familiar with noted persons as well as the persons who contributed to education in our area. So I always have my favorite, Dr. Anna Julia Cooper, who's from Raleigh, who was from Raleigh. And part of the story of Dr. Anna Julia Cooper that dovetails into St. Augustine's, understanding St. Augustine's University and the buildings that are surrounding it, is the fact that Dr. Anna Julia Cooper, Hayward Cooper, wrote and published the first feminist text from Black women, published it in 1892. In her writings, she says the cause of freedom is not the cause of a race, as you can read here. This particular quote is found in the US passports, in the current version of our US passports. It is the last entry in our passports. They have quotes from different folks. It is the only woman who is quoted in our passport. And again, this gives us clues and indications, the context, so that we can better tell the story of a certain group of people, in this case, Black folks. Again, I use this quote from Pauli Murray, and I always like what she says about true emancipation is acceptance of the whole past. That is something to remember as you think about what you're writing. And the difficulty sometimes of folk to be able to tell a story that's hard. So the patience that it takes to get these stories, and that sometimes you have to find them in the places where people are memorialized. In this case, the family home of Pauli Murray, which is in Durham, and now is a national landmark. And they have a center there that interprets the history of Black people in not just North Carolina, but Black people in general in the world. How Pauli Murray crosses several different categories in her lifespan, as a feminist, as an Episcopal priest, as someone with a sexuality that was fluid, is the way that I put it. And what she understood to be justice and equity, and how, again, seeing that home and right behind it, the cemetery, and understanding the place, that home, understanding the brick masons who were Black, who helped to build that home and who are part of her family story. All of that helps us better understand the resources that you've been called to write about. This is about Atkin High School. And again, the students had a walkout. Many of the students are still living. And so what was constructed, that new gymnasium, would also fall now within the ability to be on the National Register, depending on what is left, remains intact. And so that new construction tells us a civil rights story, and it also helps us understand this community. And so talking to these folks, the ones who were there, who actually did the walkout, and looking at their perspective over time is important in the writing. I'm gonna go through this a little bit quickly because here are some other avenues. So you might be familiar with Palmer Memorial Institute in Sedalia, which is a state historic site, the only one at the moment that interprets it's an African American woman's story, a Black woman's story. You see, I use the term African American or Black interchangeably. That often happens, and it's okay to have more than one term. What's not okay is to use negative terms and not put a frame around them. So if you do have to talk about something and be historically accurate, make sure that we understand that the person who's reading the nomination understands this is not how you refer to it, but how it was referred to in the context of its history. But one of the interesting ideas is that there was a quartet, including Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who traveled around and raising monies for Palmer Memorial Institute. And I just like this picture because it's showing her in action, and it reminds me, yeah, you sometimes have to be forceful in terms of education with our young folk. But again, this gives us information about who she is, but also the drive she had to create such an extraordinary institute. And in learning more about her story, it also tells us about the community around her. And gives us clues, for example, of where to look for more information to understand that she was part of the 3 B's of education: Mary McLeod Bethune, Nannie Helen Burroughs, and then Charlotte Hawkins Brown. Who are these women? How do they interact together? What buildings or structures or places connect them together? We can also look at the legacy of garden clubs, not just women, Black women participate in garden clubs, but Black men and women created garden clubs as a philanthropic effort, so that when you see some parks in Black communities, oftentimes they were the money to put that park there or that tennis court is raised by these garden clubs. This is an example of Nature Lovers Garden Club from the 1950s. You see how they're dressed, but that was an important part of understanding that history. That politics of respectability was a shield to help them navigate a segregated society with as much dignity as possible. And our libraries. So here in Raleigh, we are blessed to have had Molly Houston Lee, who founded Richard B. Harrison Library. She also worked at Shaw University. Can't help but plug Shaw at this time. And this is her in later life. So that is also part of what you can put in a narrative, the arc of someone's story as associated with a resource, not just frozen in a particular point in time. And as I draw to a kind of conclusion, I'm hoping that folk will have questions or comments once I get to my very, very last slide. But in this particular section, drawing your attention to people who have mattered, who may not have been recognized. So there was an exhibit called Giving Black Raleigh Her Flowers. And this is an exhibit that started at Anchor Light. It came to Shaw University last fall and will probably be at St. Augustine's University in next spring 2024. These are portraits done by young Black photographers of Black women in the Raleigh area who are seldom heard about, but had a tremendous impact. So this particular woman is Cheryl Crooms Williams. And right here, she's a part of that Oberlin Village. So I wanted to connect you back that if you are, for example, called to do a resource in Oberlin Village, here is someone that should be talked about. She's a co-founder of the Friends of Oberlin Village. That there's a group that can help with the interpretation of resources in that area. and that you might get access to it if you go to various kinds of exhibits that have been created by different people of color. Native Americans, same thing. If you go to their public discussions and displays of them as a people, you get that context that is so important, or I find so important. So here's a home, and I want you to look at this. This is a portrait of Octavia Rainey. And again, she's a resident of a particular community, College Park neighborhood, but she's also been a housing advocate, going to city council meetings, talking about preservation of her neighborhood, and thinking about how she would be able to be an active resource in understanding history. And she also created an educational tour of Black Raleigh's historic neighborhoods. And this is Miss Rainey just a few months ago, posing in front of her portrait. Valuable resource, valuable person to get information from. And as we look at people like Willoughby Player, Dr. Willoughby Player, who was the first Black woman president of a four-year institution, Bennett College, and her advocacy, her support of the Bennett women in participating in civil rights actions. So talking about that is, I find, important. And if more information can be found in such a thing as Bells of Liberty, Gender Bennett College, and the Civil Rights Movement in Greensboro, where we get a fuller story of that February 1st sit-in that the Bennett women were instrumental in helping to organize. That sit-in during the time leading up to the actual activity event of the young men from A&T sitting down, sitting in, protesting. So there's importance, and that understanding Bennett College and A&T, we can look at faculty, and that goes back, as Heather knows very well, it goes back to who were living in the neighborhood. Where did these faculty and teachers live? So the connection between where you're working and where you're living, where you're worshiping, where you're having recreation, all intertwined together. What does that mean during the time of segregation, and then the time of desegregation? And as we move forward, what does that mean? And also what it meant as we move backwards. And again, our newspapers give us these clues, give us these insight. And I say our papers, the Black newspapers, that were giving more of the story, more of the understanding. And I draw your attention to cookbooks. I know it sounds kind of out there, but the cookbooks that were written, like the Historical Cookbook of the American Negro, this was edited by Sue Bailey Thurman. This gives us an understanding of how the different connections that various prominent African Americans had with just ordinary folks, to understand that the National Council of Negro Women is a great repository of information, and that accessing that in ways like the Historical Cookbook gives us little clues. It's a historical cookbook because it's not chronological necessarily, but it has these various recipes associated with different actions and activities of Black people. And as it says on the cover, from the Emancipation Proclamation breakfast cake to the Wandering Pilgrim stew. And yes, there is a persimmon pudding recipe for North Carolina, and it's associated with Bennett College. And this is the inside of the book. talking about the favorite family recipes, charter members. All of these are nuggets of information that amplify the story. So what I'm drawing your attention to here now is another aspect of our visual, of the textiles that are created to tell stories too. And this one is harder to see, but it's behind the words "a man was lynched yesterday" is an American flag that's done in these somber colors. And this was a quilt that was created to tell one of the many stories about lynching in the United States, but it was done by Sauda Zara, who was a longtime Durham resident and part of the African American quilters circle. And in those circles, those women talking about their stories are also avenues of information that give us more of a context for understanding our various communities. So I'm going to leave you with this thought. I opened with Toni Morrison. I have to close with Toni Morrison. So as you write, as you think the language that you're using, she reminds us that sometimes we forego the nuanced, complex, midwifery properties that language can have for menace and subjugation. And that oppressive language does do more than represent violence. It is violence. And it doesn't just represent the limits of knowledge, it limits knowledge. So when we have violent language, and when I say violent, it doesn't necessarily mean about weapons, but language that cuts and hurts, and full and honest understanding of a people, when we do that, we are limiting knowledge. So this is an opportunity for y'all to open up as best you can with as open a mind as possible, knowledge in the way in which you write, in the way in which you describe and talk about and interact with the people who are representing the various resources that you have access to. The other part is to also remember, whether it's obscure state language or the faux language of mindless media, whether it is the proud but calcified language of the academy or the commodity-driven language of science, whether it is the malign language of law without ethics or language designed for the estrangement of minorities, hiding its racist plunder in its literary cheek, it must be rejected, altered, and exposed. This is the act that I'm encouraging to engage in, to act knowing that your writing has consequences and that your consequences can be positive, can be consequences that enlighten us rather than obscure important truths about the various peoples you represent in your preservation work. And I end with the final slide. I have to go back to my women at Shaw University, where we see Thomas Boyd Chapel here to the right, and our bell tower, and those dormitories that some people really like and would like to preserve. And they, in 2014, were reminding us in their signage how we are going to go forward, and we're going to do it together, and we're not going to go back, and also to trust women. And that the work that you do as consultants is work that helps preserve our democracy. So I'm encouraging you to continue to be thoughtful, to reach out to those of us who have particular knowledge about history, to engage in conversation with us and to keep your eyes open. So I am going, I do have bibliography and resources about nature. And I just want to say thank you, Sarah Woodard, Elizabeth King, and Matt Zayer, for bringing this workshop to fruition, and that my work has been supported, the research, the slides that you've seen, all by these various entities. And I'm going to stop sharing. Whew, and ask, are there comments, questions as we end? And I can see everybody now, so you can do your reactions. And I see Samantha Smith. Unmute Samantha and ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Johnson. This was such a great presentation. I first just want to thank you so much. That was very inspiring and educational, and I think I really learned a lot from your talk this morning, so thank you. I was wondering if you could go a little bit more in depth about having to navigate terminology that is inappropriate or offensive or outdated, but in a way that is done respectfully and with good context. I didn't know if you had examples that you could share, or if you could just go a little bit more in depth on how to deal with having to use that terminology while also wanting to use more appropriate language that fits today and that's also more appropriate for the group that you're describing.
Sure. So there are probably numerous kinds of examples, but I'll kind of talk you through it a little bit. When you encounter, so for example, when you encounter someone describing a group of people and using pejorative language, but yet that was part of what was going on at a particular time, then you can bracket it. I would not say to hide it necessarily, because that is it. So for example, if I'm describing the Williamton massacre, excuse me, in 1898, I can't shy away from the ways in which the N-word, I won't say it out loud, but I'm not going to, in my writing, shy away from the fact that this was used to foment violence or to get people to act in a particular way. And that's kind of how you can preface how the thing was used, how these words were used, instead of just putting the words in there without any commentary. And so what I'm trusting all of you to be able to do is to think about how you want to frame that commentary to help folk understand what happened, that it wasn't accepted by the people who were being called these pejorative words, perhaps putting even in a little language of, here is the response. There was a response in the Black-owned newspapers, for example, to this negative depiction. Or they did not, people in referring to themselves did not necessarily say that they were X, Y, and Z. You can also talk about what people did use to name themselves or to describe an activity or an event. And that's a lot of times in describing an event, you can present, here is how it was described by the majority press. Here's what the people say about this event. So those are some ideas that can come out of it. And then you could always, you know, if you write that little bit up, check it with someone who you've been working with who's part of that community. Say, does this act accurate enough? Is this a fair depiction? Because we want fairness and we don't want to hide what happened. You can't.
Thank you.
I hope I got to your question.
You definitely did. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yes, Cynthia.
Thank you. I sort of have a follow-up to this. I am currently writing about a couple of railroad towns, and both the press at the time and even histories written not very long ago keep referring to these railroads as having been built by convict labor. I'm really uncomfortable referring to it that way. So I talk about the workers who built the railroad. But I was just wondering, I don't think that I have, especially given the scope of my work, any real way to figure out who the actual individuals were who did the work. I was just wondering if you had any comments on something like that. It's not as obvious, I think, to us yet as dealing with narratives that talk about slaves versus enslaved people and things like that. So I was just wondering if you have comments about that.
So the way I would approach it, and because you do want people to know that these were incarcerated persons. They didn't have volition. They were told they had to do it. And they were labeled as convicts. But you can say that these were workers who came out. Where did they come from? And then say they're referred to as convict labor. But I prefer, or it is more accurate to describe them as workers, ...
Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Other comments or, yes, Heather,
Hi.
since I called you out.
I know you did. Well, we're meeting on Thursday and I'm going to ask the neighborhood what they want to be called. So we may vote, but I was just going to follow up on something that you said where I'm very fortunate in that I do a lot of work with Sherry Skidronsky and we review a lot of each other's work. And I know some of the other consultants have other people because I found it's helpful. Sometimes I write something and she'll read it and say, I don't think this means what you think it means, or I think you're trying to say something else here. And so having other people to review your work before it gets all the way up. And I've had some similar things where Beth King in my survey reports has said, I don't think you want to say this the way you're saying it. So having someone in your sort of safe space who you can say something and not be afraid that you're sounding like an idiot, and they can call you out on it.
That is, yes, and that's like basic to my writing is like, I need a check. But also think about organizations like the African American Heritage Commission. So Ashley Adams, who does the NC Civil Rights right now, I'm putting her on the spot and she's not here, but she may have ideas about framing or, comments. So think also of folks who you would consider trustworthy, who might be a little bit outside your circle, but who may have other kinds of knowledge, content especially about a particular place. I would think about that too. And we've got great museum staff. Some of our curators have a particular eye toward understanding or framing history. And I would trust some of them too. Any other comments? And y'all are so welcome. I'm getting some thank yous, and I appreciate you staying with us during this presentation and just thinking. Yes, Mr. Jones, Robbie.
Hi, I'm actually in Nashville, Tennessee, but we have an office in North Carolina, and I worked a lot there in the past. But we reached out to African American advisors for a project in Memphis because we're talking about civil rights and Black history, and Memphis is a majority Black city. And one of our we had gender bias show up in our reviewers who were Black. And one of our Black reviewers is an elderly guy who participated in the civil rights movement. And we'd had in our history, we were trying to talk about the females who work behind the scenes and who haven't got the proper acknowledgement that they deserve in the civil rights movement. And he kind of dismissed that and said, no, 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 the men did the work and the women, were in the background. And of course, we had a very delicate situation there about, how do you say, well, thank you so much for your input, but it may not be what we're, may not be the story that we're hearing. How would you recommend that we deal with that when we may get advice or input from our African-American reviewers and consultants and advisors that may not be exactly right? You know what I mean? Like, I assume, obviously we got to get more voices, but, it's a delicate matter when you're in that situation where you're asking them for advice and it may not be exactly right.
So part of it is perspective, and to remind those who are reading that there are various perspectives depending on your status. If you're a Black male of a certain age, yeah, you are going to be biased. As you noticed from my presentation, I focus a lot on women because they often get left out of the story or how we frame our narratives. So, and that's why I say trust the women a little bit. That we've had that very same thing happen with the sit-ins in Greensboro, February 1, just tomorrow, where a lot of attention was drawn toward the Greensboro 4. They're always talking about the Greensboro 4, and yet we know from others information, documented information, like from Willoughby Player, that the Bennett women were engaged in all that planning. And in fact, in Nashville, in the library, in the civil rights room, there's a reference to young people from North Carolina talking to Diane Nash and other folks about the planning of the sit-ins and what to do as they were amping up, because they knew sit-ins had occurred before. 1957 Royal Ice Cream sit-in in Durham, North Carolina. That happened, but it didn't get that kind of recognition. So creating more of a kind of a dialogue within the writing. I know you don't have infinite space, but to give the sense that there are different perspectives, but there's a nugget, a kernel of truth there, in terms of there were multiple participants in the civil rights movement who had different roles, and the women were prominent in a sense. They were very present. I should put it
Yeah.
that way.
That's what we're doing. We're actually working on this national civil rights in PDF. We just got started, and we done work in Frankfort, Kentucky, and one of my co-workers who's a women's history expert always wants to make sure the women's story is not left out. So we're very cognizant of that. And it was just one of those instances where you expect your advisors to come in and have an inclusive, want to tell the full story and be inclusive, and he was like, oh, no. And so that was new one on me. But gender bias is obviously, it's everywhere. But yeah, I appreciate your input, and it's good to know that it's not just this one instance, that it's happens elsewhere, and that we told the woman's story anyhow. We're like, thank you so much, but we're not cutting it out.
And one of your allies would be the Scarrett Bennett Center.
Yes.
They've got folk who know how to frame, and then Highlander Center, of course, is another place of resource. But since you're in Nashville, you just go down to Scarrett Bennett Center and talk to some folk there.
Definitely.
But the other bias that often occurs, that's why I brought in Joseph Holt Jr., is age. That how did younger people play into the narrative, and kind of bringing out those voices, if, as appropriate. But just thinking, who else should be here that might not be here, is one of the things that I would think of.
Yeah.
And it's not perfect. It's not always going to be, but at least thinking about it and being aware. is very helpful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So again, thank you all for the comments in the chat.
Yep. Thank you all for being here, and Dr. Johnson, thank you again for bringing this presentation to us. I really appreciate the effort and the time, and I look forward to seeing you next week at NRAC.
Yes.
And yeah, so thank you all for being here again, and really appreciate everybody's time.
Yes, thank you, everyone, especially my SHPO. Oh, yes. And the consultant. I really appreciate the work y'all do. I know it can sometimes be dicey, but
Yep.
it has to be done, and we need it because we need that preservation to remain in the forefront of our society.
We are fortunate in North Carolina to have a great group of consultants that work here in our state. So, all right. Well, thank you,
All right.
everyone. We'll sign off.
Thank you.
Thank you.